We are here for another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. Here today with Stoic Dan. He's on Twitter, Facebook. He has a website, all of which I will be putting up in our in the description for this video. But thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for talking about Stoicism, one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, you I guess in a way found me. That's the thing I like about social media is the way you can make connections. I had been attending Stoic Week 2020 and Stoicon 2020, and I mentioned in my Twitter I had attended. I put the hashtags up, and you actually got in touch with me and just mentioned how great it was. You thought I was attending and how interesting. So thank you so much for reaching out. First of all.
Yeah, the Stoicon 2020 event this year that you mentioned, it was the first time it was online. Previously, they had it in different cities. And this year, when it was online, the Twitter activity was very high. A lot of people were commenting on it, taking screenshots of it. It was a good learning experience.
That's something that's really interesting because when we think about Stoicism, our natural inclination is to think about Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, ancient Greece, Rome. It's not necessarily to think about things like Twitter, Facebook, virtual conferences. Does that just go to show how, or what in your opinion does that say about Stoicism, that it can find a home not only in ancient thought and philosophy, but in modern technology, modern ways of communicating, the fact that it's still, or it can be so prevalent in those arenas?
Well, that's a good idea. The modern Stoicism movement is something that is always adapting. And the reason why they started the modern Stoicism movement was to adapt the ancient wisdom and bring it to the modern era so that people in this modern age could benefit from it. But also in that adaptation, we also use things like technology. For some of the great Stoic scholars that we have today, like Massimo Pigliucci and Donald Robertson, John Sellers, they all use technology in different ways. I know one of them likes broadcasts more through the internet, one likes Twitter more, one likes Facebook more, but they are adapting to use technology. It's interesting to note, by the way, that in philosophy in general, technology is a neutral. It has good and it has bad aspects. It's just like the weather. The weather has good and bad aspects. It's just our impressions of it that make it seem good or bad at any one time. But really, overall, it's neutral. And I think to answer your question, technology is just one of the tools that Stoicism is now using, hopefully for good, to spread the message and to help educate people about this belief system that can help smooth out their lives.
How would you define Stoicism? Let's start with the very basic. Very basic.
Maybe I should take an extra sip of my and think about this a little more. It's a very hard belief system to summarize in just one definition. Some people would say the four cardinal values is what Stoicism is about. Others would say that Stoics are always seeking virtue in everything that they do. Other people who've been through my group discussions might say that it's great for reducing stress or reducing anger because that's how it impacted those people. I think that Stoicism has a lot of definitions, but the one thing I can tell you in terms of the modern Stoicism movement is that it gives people a large collection of tools. You may just pick up one or two or many of them, and it will help improve your life. It'll help you think through your problems instead of reacting to them. It will help you reduce anger and stress in your life. And but it's also important to note that these benefits can also be gotten from Buddhism or Taoism. Those belief systems also have ways of improving your life. And you have to just see if Stoicism applies to you or not by trying it out.
You mentioned the four cardinal virtues. of Stoicism. I mentioned in a couple of videos I did regarding Stoic Week 2020 that the four cardinal virtues, as referenced in Stoicism, seem very similar to the four cardinal virtues that we have in Freemasonry that we're taught in our first degree. So discuss those four cardinal virtues, if you could, what they mean, where they kind of came from, and how we interpret them, or how you interpret them today.
Right. Well, the first interesting thing is when your viewers go to the internet and they Google four cardinal values for Stoicism, the first thing they should know is they're going to get mostly the same results, wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, but there may be a little bit of a phrasing difference depending on whose article you land on. Or if it's the encyclopedia, of philosophy, you may still get a little bit of variance compared to what the scholars are talking about. I know that the last one there, temperance, is sometimes rephrased as moderation. And to answer your question, these four cardinal values, they just represent a lot of the things that embody our actions and our thoughts as a Stoic. And these four things, these four terms, which were written about by the ancient Stoics, which is Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, mostly, those are the big three. They, in turn, took it from further back in history. Plato and Socrates also developed these ideas. So the scholars are still working on how far back it goes, but often Plato and Socrates also get some credit for these four terms.
How do we understand those terms in a modern context? Has there been much change, would you say, in the way a Stoic understood those terms versus the way we would understand them, or have they stayed pretty consistent, throughout time? Because I know, for example, Stoicism, in terms of its understanding of nature and the physical universe, it was different times, so their scientific understanding of the universe was different. But the actual, moral ideas, or those terms, would you say they've remained pretty consistent over time, or did they have somewhat different understandings of them?
Yeah, that's the natural world, or the cosmos, is really one area of Stoicism that is, it's a good example to discuss the history of it, because back then, Stoics did talk about your code of conduct and how you should act towards others and towards yourself, working out problems. But they did also talk about the cosmos, which we would today think of as either physics or astronomy, something like that. And that part of Stoicism, that physics and astronomy part, has not really been modernized much and is not of much use for us in the modern era, because although they were foresighted back then, now a lot of their discoveries, 2,000 years later, everyone just knows it as common knowledge. And it's also been updated. They also had some misconceptions back then. But the important part of Stoicism that has come down to the modern day is more about your conduct, your seeking of virtue, and how it can help us in dealing with stress, anxiety, things like that. Those are things, by the way, that we still don't understand well enough to manage ourselves. So that's where we need help.
So what type of help then does a Stoic philosophy provide? I have some ideas based more on my experience with Freemasonry and the connections I see between Stoicism and Freemasonry. When I think of how Freemasonry can help people live a better life, my assumption is perhaps Stoicism has some of those same benefits. But from your perspective, as someone who has studied and practices Stoicism, how does it help people in their day-to-day life deal with stress and anxiety and the challenges?
Well, I'll give you two quick examples for a personal life story and a business example for Stoicism. In our discussions recently at the Orlando Stoics, We talked about an example of a person who goes into their annual checkup with their doctor, and they find out that they have some new issue, which causes them anxiety because now they've got to go see a specialist. They don't know what that test result will turn out to be. Am I really sick with something? And I'm just thinking about all this, I'm getting stressed out. That's what a person might do if they're not well trained in Stoicism or another belief system. And if you do use or apply Stoicism to a situation like this, the person who's now got to go to a specialist, instead of worrying about what that specialist will say or what condition might be found, they will occupy themselves more in the present moment. And they won't worry too much about the future because a Stoic understands the future is mostly uncertain. You cannot know the future until it arrives. And so to spend too much time in negative thinking about what might happen, what might be wrong, instead of spending or dwelling too much in that future worry, they would just spend time thinking about, well, I'm going to make time to see my specialist, and I'll make a decision at that time what I'm going to do. So it's a little bit more on the rational side of thinking than the emotional side. And this same idea can be applied to business. The other example I wanted to share with you is sometimes in business, people are going into a meeting and they don't know what to expect. They might be negotiating a price for something. Like, let's say you're going into a meeting to buy a car, or if you're going into an interview. Again, these issues come up of like, oh, what's going to happen? I don't know. And you could worry about those things too. But if you're going in for an interview, you can think to yourself, well, I've prepared myself as best I can. I've got my curriculum vitae, laid out on a piece of paper. All the important things are there. If I'm going in for a negotiation on a price for like a new car, I know what I can pay. I know I can't pay over this, and I have to meet somewhere in the middle or it's no deal. A Stoic would think these things out in advance, but would not stress about them so much.
Yeah, the value of that idea of control and understanding what is within and what is without your control, and using that to not stress about those things that are outside of your control. That seems to be one of those core principles of Stoicism. It seems to be the one thing that most everybody, when they think of Stoicism, kind of recognizes on some level. The other thing, though, the other conception that people have of Stoicism, which may be a misconception based on my experience with Stoic Week and my readings, is there's a real lack of emotion with Stoicism. That if something is outside of your control, that means that you shouldn't have any feelings towards it whatsoever. So, if your family member or loved one is sick or passes away, because that's not in your control, you shouldn't have any feelings towards it beyond a logical, rational kind of c'est la vie approach. I guess, what are your thoughts on that conception or perhaps misconception?
Yeah, that's and you stated it just right there. It's part conception, part misconception. There's a mythical value to Stoicism. That is, through time, our culture has a certain mythos around people who are Stoics, like, oh, they're completely unemotional, they don't react at all, they're antisocial, whatever. But that is the myth. The important part of Stoicism is that we recognize our emotions when they arrive. And that's for something that's both happy or something that's sad or upsetting. We realize that these emotions are coming to us and we are able to deal with them better. We do not try to eliminate them completely. That's Stoicism with a capital S. In other words, we're being Stoics in a philosophical sense. But in the mythical sense of Stoicism, or a Stoic with lowercase s, that's just a cultural definition, which is not completely true, that we're completely passive or unemotional. I think the better example that we often talk about in articles today in Stoicism is that we do feel emotions, but we try to curb them. We do not try to eliminate them. We try to process them better. And a good example, like recently I was talking with someone about Stoicism for parenting. And of course, the popular example came up for if something stressful comes up, don't react to it as the parent right away. Instead, take a moment to process it, maybe count to 5 or count to 10. Think about how to best approach this with the child or the teenager, and then handle the situation. So that if you are upset or suddenly angry about something that happened, you won't react to that part of the feeling.
How's it going? Not bad. Want to come say hi? We got a Stoic Dan on here. He's an interview for a podcast I'm doing. Want to come say hello? There's Jim.
Good morning, Jim.
Good morning. Good morning.
How's it going? Not bad.
I'll let you get on.
This makes it more fun. You know, some Masonic lodges are suspended, some are meeting, some are doing virtual stuff, and it's all thanks to the current pandemic. How do you, which is a very good point to bring up, how do you think Stoicism can affect, or how do you think a Stoic should approach the current pandemic, current circumstances, all the uncertainty surrounding it? What are some of your thoughts on Stoicism's connection to, the current situation?
All right, well, the thing that I think many of the authors, podcasters about Stoicism have brought out is that in this pandemic, although things can seem very harsh at a certain time in your life, the first thing a Stoic realizes is that my impression of the world or of this pandemic is what's making it seem harsh. It's really not going to be as harsh as it seems. This goes back to words by Marcus Aurelius that our thoughts and our impressions are often worse than the event itself. Or maybe that was Epictetus. I think they both wrote about this. But for example, initially in the pandemic, when items on the grocery store shelves were emptying out and we didn't have as much supply of things looked pretty bad, but it did get better than that. And some supplies were in greater availability than others. For myself, I know I couldn't buy certain foods that I wanted. So as a Stoic, I adapted and I just tried different foods that were still on the shelves. That's how I adapted to that situation. And another way, just to round out this question, another way a Stoic might think about the pandemic is that people through history have gotten through a lot worse than this. The bubonic plague or something which killed many more people through history. That's something that our species has gotten through. And right now, this pandemic may seem bad, but it's not as bad as those things. So we can survive this too.
A couple of possible critiques of Stoicism. I'm curious as to what your take on those would be. One, and this could have to do with the nature of Stoicism of when it was developed, which was, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius would be, I guess, maybe one of the most recent of the ancient Stoics. I think it seems like he's the one who pops up, right? The last of the good emperors of Rome. There's how much would Stoics have recognized? Trying to think of the connection or the way to put it. The possible, the brain as a physical system and how that creates a consciousness, because it seems as though one thing the Stoics really emphasized was there's an external world that's outside of your control. And by external world, that would include oftentimes much of your physical body. So if you have a heart defect or some type of injury, your physical body may not be something you have full control over due to injury, sickness, disease, but your mind, which we might describe as a consciousness now, is different. It's something that is fully within your control. So even if you have a physical impairment or a physical illness, you can reason about that in a way that is helpful to you. But now that we have things such as, we're more aware of things such as traumatic brain injury, mental diseases that affect our ability to reason. Do you think that, I guess, how does a Stoic consider the idea of an injury to the brain that can then affect our ability to reason? Or would the Stoics say that even in that, so long as you're aware of that issue, you can reason about it, even if the physical structure of your brain is injured or damaged in some way, or different, just not neurotypical?
All right, well, that's a big question. The credit, first of all, for what we can control and what we can't control in the world, that goes back to Epictetus. He gets credit for that. His student Arian, lucky for the rest of us in history, his student wrote down all of his great teachings. And in the Enchiridion, Epictetus begins by saying, that everything in the world is divided between what we can and can't control. And you're right. The way it was written back then and the way they thought about it back then was basically, my thoughts are the only things that I can control. Things that I desire in the world, or things that I am averse to, things that I would tend to avoid. Those thoughts are really the only thing I can control. Everything else, the weather, the thoughts of other people, my reputation, my properties, all those other things, I may think that I can control them, like especially my property. I own my house, it's under my control, but actually it's not. A windstorm can blow it down, a fire can burn it down. You could have something from the emperor and he takes it away. Anything can happen back then as well as now with all these things: property, weather, prestige. And that is the way they divided it back then. Now, in modern times, some of the Stoic scholars and authors have been saying that it's not just one or the other, which is sometimes called the dichotomy of control. Some of them have renamed it the trichotomy of control. In other words, things you can and can't control, and then things in the middle that are partially under your control. And they would argue that your health, for example, is partially under your control. You can have a good diet, you can get enough sleep, and you can be generally healthy, but then you can still get the COVID-19 virus, and you can still get sick, so you can't control it completely. Now, there are some scholars, I think, who have made a good point. I think Massimo Pigliucci, in a recent keynote speech, he did describe that he dislikes the trichotomy term, and he would rather just think of it as what you can and can't control. But that's just a preference on his part. I think other scholars have embraced the idea that if we can just help people understand this better, whatever the terms are, we should help people do that. And to answer your question about mental illness or mental disability, I think there's very little of the ancient Stoics who address that, but modern Stoics have acknowledged there are some people who may not be able to be helped by Stoicism. They freely admit that Stoicism only works for some people, not just those who, where the Stoic concepts click for them. But yes, you do have to have a certain mental ability to study this philosophy. If someone were not able to do that, they might need to adopt a different philosophy.
And how do you think Stoicism, I'm not sure, it just is something I was thinking about. I can't figure out if I truly believe it or not, but it's an interesting idea about Stoicism. It seems that one danger of it could be that it might affect the idea of like innovation or thinking outside of the box. So like Epictetus, for example, was a slave. And he certainly would welcome. And I believe, if I recall correctly, he eventually became free. He bought his freedom, if I recall correctly.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. But it would never occur to him, for example, to run away or to do, because it was all about the natural order of things. Stoics were very much believing in the idea of there's an order and everybody should play their part. So, an example might be, I'll use Star Trek as an example because I like it so much. I don't know if you're a fan of Star Trek, but there's the famous James T. Kirk from the original series who, in order to pass his test, he cheated. And he ended up passing the test. That famously, Spock, the quote unquote Stoic, would never consider doing that because that isn't within the rules of the game. It does seem that perhaps when Stoics are emphasizing this idea of what can I control versus what can't I control, and what's natural versus not so much, that thinking outside of the box element or looking at the quote unquote crazy ideas may not be as prevalent in that as, say, other types of philosophies. Or would a Stoic be able to think of the more unusual solution, or the bending the rules or breaking the rules in order to get the certain result? Or would that be kind of against this idea of living in life according to the order of the universe, that type of thing?
Yeah. Well, that is a good Star Trek reference, but I think that it could be debated philosophically. Is that a good choice or not? When Kirk cheated to beat to pass that, I forget what name they gave to that.
Kobayashi Maru.
Oh, Kobayashi, right. So that test was not designed to be passable. It was just to see how you react under pressure. And I think as they phrased it in that story, how the captain reacts under pressure will save people's lives. Now, that's a very virtuous type of thinking or action, but the cheating on the test to beat the system, that I could also argue from philosophical terms is unethical, because the goal of this test, of this university, is to get educated. And if you just cheat your way to the end, then you haven't really gotten the education needed. So I think that there's a plus and a minus on that example. To give you, I think, what I would say is a better Star Trek reference for this conversation is, do you remember the episode when Kirk, Spock, and some others were, I think, they were beamed down to some planet, and it looked like Tombstone, Arizona, and they had to battle the Earps and the whatever the other Western town. Yeah, now that one I remember as interesting because they created some device to help them get the advantage in the battle that was going to happen, and but they realized the device which created smoke, they realized it would not work, and so Spock suggested that we should test it anyway, even though we have only one sample and we don't have enough time to build another one to create another smoke screen. And what I remember is that they tested it and it didn't work. And even though they had used up the only sample that they had to gain advantage, they did have a better understanding of the world that they were in at that moment. That some of the physics were working and some were not. And that's what they used, I think, to, in the end, get out of that scenario. And I think that represents, for me, a very Stoic example of just trying things. Even when you realize it may not work, if you try things out, you may have a better understanding of how to get through a certain situation, because you may discover something you didn't plan on learning. And that's thinking out of the box.
What would you say, since we're on this topic, some examples in pop culture of Stoicism that you would steer people towards?
Well, in the modern day discussions, I know a very real example that people talk about is Picard on the newer, compared to the original series of Star Trek. He was on the Next Generation, of course. He represented a very Stoic character, and of course, yeah, aside from the Star Trek references, we also have people who are mentioned like Gandhi and Thoreau. This is not pop culture, but it is history, recent history. Some of their characters have certain Stoic qualities. And see what else. Maybe Lincoln has a certain Stoic quality to him.
Any writings in particular of those individuals, or in general, on a ancient or modern examples?
Well, I know that in terms of writing, the writing of Thoreau, for example, his most famous book, Walden, where he went in the woods for 2 years, 2 months in some to live. He was seeking a very simple life. And you might think, well, wait a minute, that doesn't connect with any of the things we've talked about reducing anger or realizing what I can or can't control in the world. But Thoreau was exploring another important part of what we call today Stoicism, is he was exploring just living in a simple fashion, not needing a lot of possessions or attachments around me to feel happy. He realized that just simple nature and living in a simple fashion was what brought him happiness.
Yeah, the quote unquote simple life. How do you think modern? It seems that it might be a harder sell today with Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, such an emphasis on appearance and the Instagram, right? That's all it is. It's people's appearances. It's people showing off what they have, or even sometimes what they don't have. If they're living a quote unquote simple life, they still find a way to brag about living a simple life on Instagram. How do you how would a Stoic, what would a Stoic think of, or from a Stoic perspective, what is the considerations for social media and how it's affecting our lives, in a positive way, in a negative way, or does it go back to, again, it's not the social media, it's the way we interact with it that's relevant?
Right. Well, in social media in general, I think that if the Stoics were alive today, like Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, they would look at one side of social media, which is the great ability.
We got another, sorry to interrupt, we got another guest. Come on, say hello. We got Glenn Teskey.
Okay.
Settling down.
Good morning, Glenn.
Good morning.
Glenn
Nice
is all
to see
about
you.
You would love this conversation. He's always reading. We're talking about Stoicism.
Yes. Stoicism influences Christianity and a lot of things.
Yeah, so make sure, Cameron, you give him the link to the video after it's published, so
Oh,
he
I
can
will.
review the whole conversation.
He's been a guest a few times himself, so he knows, he's checked it out. But he's always reading philosophy. He could have a 10-hour conversation with him about this stuff.
Well, maybe. Unfortunately, I've got some obligations right now, but it's good to see you in like in picture form rather than just a name.
Very good. Have a good day. All right. So I like the free-flowing element of this podcast interview. This is better than the usual. It does have a different feeling to it. But to get back to your question, I think that some of the Stoics, if they were alive today, they would look at social media and think what a great opportunity we have to connect to each other, to understand each other better. And on the other hand, the lifestyle aspect that you mentioned, like on Instagram, of people pretending to, or just showcasing the best part of their lives, I think that society has already gained a certain Stoic wisdom about that, because there are some Instagram influencers who I've seen in articles where it's shown that they photoshopped themselves into a scene, or they made some picture look better than it actually was. And I think that in that way, people are realizing that influencers are trying to change reality and just make it look better. And in lying that way, it's not really helping anything. It's just creating a buzz for a moment, but it doesn't really help anyone. So I think that society is a little bit educated about that now.
The other thing about social media that I worry about, though we're seeing a move away from this more and more, is it's hard to have a conversation via Twitter, Facebook. Conversations are it's hard to do it at 140 characters at a time. It seems like with this, I mean, guys like, obviously Joe Rogan is the quintessential example. It seems like there's a real hunger for conversing, for full conversations that can take half an hour, or even longer. And I think that maybe connects back to not just Stoicism, but philosophy in general, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans who would spend time conversing and talking about these things and not, typing out a Twitter thread per se. Do you think, did Stoics, I guess, what was the Stoic view on conversation, such as this, just in general, on discussion and on debate? And what would they think of kind of the modern ways in which people are communicating?
I'm thinking the same thing. That's I can make an interesting comparison that aside from a Twitter, 140 characters, or even a Facebook posting that goes a little bit longer, you're right. These longer conversations are more valuable in some ways because we go deeper into a subject. We can explore it better. And think about what we're doing right now. We're on a podcast, which can go half an hour or more. We're exploring this topic in detail, and anyone who's watching, although they can't participate in this conversation, they can listen to the details and the tangents that we're getting into. And there is, by the way, an equivalent of this podcast format 2,000 years ago. If we go back to Seneca the Younger, I think he died in the year 65. And before he died, I think the last 5 or 10 years of his life, he wrote a series of letters, which we today call letters from a Stoic. And he's writing to his friend Lucilius, who, by the way, the historians have found out was a real person. He was probably the treasurer of a town nearby. And when he was writing to Lucilius, he wrote in a form of letters, which is a long form type of discussion like we're having in this podcast. And he covers a lot of interesting Stoic concepts that Seneca had covered in other books, but now it's in a more of a friendly dialogue. Even though we don't hear back from Lucilius, it was a longer format and a detailed format.
Yeah, and so many of those letters have survived over time, right, and come down to us from the ancients.
Yeah, I think there are 120 of them or so.
So yeah, so that would be the ancient example of it, which just goes to show the value of these records and keeping them. And also, it seems like people have always thirsted for conversation throughout time, right? It's something I think innately human, is the desire to talk to one another, and not just in short snippets, but to actually engage in a meaningful way. Something that Freemasonry, I think, promotes very well also. I know you said you don't know a lot about Freemasonry, but what do you think the Stoic view in general of fraternities, sororities, of just generally the tendency for people to kind of congregate together in groups, be they religious, political, or in the case of Freemasonry, fraternal organizations, and same thing, sororities. Eastern Star is the female kind of branch of Freemasonry. what would a Stoic think about, especially considering modern times, of Masonic lodges, Masonic temples, fraternal organizations in general?
Well, in some respects, I think we could learn from you. It would be interesting if the Stoics had a series of lodges or meeting, buildings around the country where we could meet regularly, because there isn't that yet. We do have Stoic groups that meet or met before the pandemic, and they usually met at cafes or other venues. But it would be great if we could have an increased level of interest that we did invest in lodges or buildings around the country where we could have regular meetings. And even more than that, that would give us a chance not just to discuss things, but also to do practice sessions, to do journaling, to do other activities that a modern Stoic practice enjoys when you want to get the most out of the philosophy. I think that another interesting thing I've heard, I mean, the name of this podcast, The Square and the Compass, is a part of your logo, isn't it?
Yes. I'm constantly getting pooped on by a few people because technically it should be called Square and Compasses, because compass is compass is a instrument for finding direction. Compasses are what you see on our logo. When you see a Masonic lodge, you'll see the square and then the compasses beneath. But no one whenever I'm talking about it or mention the symbol, I'll say, "Do you see the square and compass?" Nobody ever uses square and compasses, but
well, I was interested more in the meaning behind it. I read somewhere that the square and the compasses in the Masonic lodge, the image of that has something to do with your conduct, that it should be within bounds or within, it should serve others. It should be measured. It should be thoughtful. Something along those lines is what I read. And that's very close to, I mean, that's one of the parts of Stoicism, is how you treat your fellow person, your fellow citizen, is very important, because that interconnectedness was something the Stoics realized 2,000 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah, that is the brief history is obviously Freemasonry as it exists today, kind of descended from stonemasons of the 15th, 16th, 17th century. Stonemasons, people who literally built cathedrals, castles. Obviously, they used tools such as the square, compasses, numerous other tools in order to create right angles, to build their buildings, and to work on the stone. And Freemasons, we appropriated those tools in a moral sense to work on our moral character. So we derive lessons from a square, from compasses, from other tools that stonemasons would have used. And as you're going through your degrees, you are given and shown tools, but then you're meant to relate to them in a moral sense. So certainly square and compasses are the most famous. And the general idea of a square and a compass or compasses is the idea of acting in due bounds and in accordance with nature. So the idea of the compasses, especially, and this is something from Stoicism, is if you consider the 2 points of a compass, then those represent the limits of the natural world, and you should always try to stay within those 2 points and within the natural world and not go outside of it, outside of that circle. So yeah, that is something when I was reading Stoic thoughts that stuck out at me, is there's a connection here for sure. Although that's an interesting point too. How would a Stoic approach their differing relationships? Because for myself, I have my Masonic relationships, my Masonic brothers. You've met a couple here today. Then there are my friends who are outside of lodge. Then there are just strangers. What do Stoics say? Your first duty is to your Masonic lodge, and then to your friends, and then to your countrymen. Would it be more like how does a Stoic navigate those relationships? Because especially in modern times, you've got so many, it feels like, concentric circles when you add in social media. You know, you've got your Facebook group friends, you've got your work friends, you've got your teammates, you've got, you know, there's so many different ways people are being pulled. How does a Stoic kind of deal with those competing relationships?
Right. Well, in this case, they often go back to something called the Circles of Herocles, which are concentric circles as you describe them. Herocles, that's Hierocles, if your fans want to Google it. These circles start with you and your family, and then it does move outward to greater circles of friends, your town, your country. And then recently in modern Stoicism, I think someone added another circle for all humanity or for the earth. And they wanted to include not just the greater population, but also the planet itself. And they wanted to acknowledge that there is some obligation you have for the planet, whether that might be sustainability or ecologically or whatever. But to answer your question directly, is the Stoics did know about having conflicts between different obligations or between different groups of people. So they just started with your obligation to the smallest group and then move outward from that. They also said that it takes more time to practice this. You can't just start serving all humanity from the beginning. You have to start by doing well just with a small group of friends and working outward.
The fracturing of it seems to me, I don't know what your opinion on this is, it seems that there's a greater and greater amount of fracturing amongst people in terms of these relationships down, you know, political, especially political and religious fault lines. It seems to me that I would say I wouldn't even make that distinction. It seems so often politics has become a type of religion for people. You know, in Freemasonry, one rule that we have is that during lodge, there is no political or religious discussion allowed. But even then, unfortunately, and this is something I just don't know how we manage to avoid it, is that rule only applies in lodge when you're meeting. So, you know, 4 hours, 5 hours a month, about, if you have 2 meetings a month. Outside of lodge, you know, people, Masons and non-Masons, but in this case, Freemasons are, you know, they're putting opinions up politically on Facebook, and then another Mason responds on Facebook. And then by the time you get back to lodge, it's very hard to put what was said on Facebook away necessarily. The people don't forget just because you bang the gavel to start a lodge meeting. And you see that with families, you know, at dinner, how easy is it for a father to forget, you know, the fight he had with whoever, his son, on Facebook, or different people voting. I guess, do you think Stoics would recognize in modern context this fracturing along political lines? Do you think it's as big of a deal as people are making it out to be? It just seems like we're going towards a place that there's not an easy resolution towards, in terms of, like I said, this fracturing of relationships. And what would the Stoic solution be to it?
Right. Yeah, I've talked about this in my videos on YouTube, where I'm observing, and I think a lot of people like you've just mentioned, they notice that we have an increasing amount of divisiveness in our country and maybe around the world, where we're standing apart and we're talking past each other and we're not really understanding each other as well as we should. One of the things that a Stoic or someone in philosophy could help in this situation is just by saying, listen first of all, listen more to the other side instead of trying to push your agenda on them. If you listen more, you may understand something they're saying, or they may actually have a good idea that you might learn from. And then secondly, when you are talking with someone else, instead of just talking past them or over them, maybe you can find some resolution, either just agree to disagree, or maybe there's some middle ground that you can agree on. When discussing whatever political idea, maybe there's some middle ground you can find. But it's true, a lot of the world right now, I don't know if it's just technology or the politicians who are doing this, or maybe technology may be amplifying it, but we do seem to be increasingly divisive, and we need to find a way to talk to each other again.
Yeah, it's something that very much, I don't know how much of it is a recency bias or a proportional bias versus how much of it is legitimate. I mean, it feels like it's a particularly challenging time right now, but that could just be because I'm living right now. Maybe the Stoics would point out that, is it any more challenging than 1918, when we had the Spanish Spanish flu, or you even go back to Stoic times. I mean, what was the average life expectancy for somebody in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, versus, even with everything going on today, I'm going to live longer than the average Roman under Marcus Aurelius by, I think the average life expectancy was 30. So I've already got the Romans beat by, 7 years. So how much of this, and that seems like a very Stoic idea, is trying to pay attention to your biases and recognizing it might seem important, but that could just be because you're going through it from a historical perspective. It's actually not that big of a deal compared to what others have gone through.
Right. Well, there is a Stoic concept that you have to beware of your impressions of the world. And I think that includes this idea that you're talking about, that right now things may seem pretty bad because we've just lived through recent history, and maybe everything is just piling on top of us. We think of the political season, we think about a pandemic, we think about the availability of certain products in the store, that all these things, and then global problems, and there's a war breaking out in another country, protests in London. I mean, all this can pile onto you, but this is covered by the Stoic idea of impressions. Is you step out of that and you realize that all this incoming stuff is something that can fool me, or to create an illusion, so to speak. So if you study Stoicism a little more, then you'll realize that in this area, you can respond to these impressions in a better way. You can think that, oh, there was a lot of this chaos. There was a lot of this chaos going on 2,000 years ago too, and they dealt with it. So I just have to beware not now, so that I don't get overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, it's bias is an interesting idea, or I think a Stoic would refer to bias as impressions, right? The way we interpret things. I mentioned this in a couple of podcasts, but I was a probation officer for about 5 years, and then I worked at a jail for 5 years as a rehab officer was the title. But the ideas in Stoicism seem very much connected to cognitive behavioral theories, which is something that was used a lot by probation officers, by the jail, right? We called it the can't even think of the name now, the behavior chain, basically. The idea that there's an event, then you have your thoughts and your feelings and your physical responses to that event. So, physical responses as in like heart rate, adrenaline, the physical effects of those thoughts and feelings, and then your action, and then your outcome. So I gotta, just because I was in that world for so long, what are your perspectives on Stoicism and how it can benefit a population for people who have committed criminal acts, have trouble with violence, with anger, with abuse, domestic abuse, things of that nature, or also are struggling with their own history of either being abused or being victimized? what is the Stoic approach to those things, and how can Stoicism benefit? I have my own ideas based on my training in CBT, which seems very similar to Stoicism, but take it away.
Right. Well, in CBT, of course, that goes back to Albert Ellis. Many in the modern Stoicism movement are giving credit to Albert Ellis for borrowing ideas from Stoicism to create. I think he first worked on REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, and then 10 years later it became CBT. I think that's the little history of it there. But a lot was borrowed from Stoicism. And yes, controlling our emotions and our reactions to things is a very important part if you want to have a smoother life. You know, there's some people that I know in my lifetime, I've met some people who are naturally not aggressive, but they can lose their temper very easily. In other words, they get very upset easily. And I think in some cases they've done it so long that they're used to it. They may even enjoy it, or they maybe just it's a part of their lifestyle and they don't even realize they're doing it anymore. But a Stoic realizes that it's better to have a smoother type of existence, to not have all these ups and downs where you're getting super angry and then you're calm later on that day. All those bumps in the road that you're going through is making your life difficult, and probably having health effects to it as well. You know, I can't imagine it being a healthy thing to get so angry once a day or once a week. But to answer your other question about, for certain populations, I really think Stoicism is good for everyone, but only if they feel it applies to them. You know, whether you're an inmate in a facility or whether you're a politician, I think that anywhere in between, any group in society could benefit from Stoicism. That potential is there, and it's just a matter of you discovering it. It could also be that someone discovers that Buddhism is a better flavor of philosophy to smooth out their lives that way. They really have to try things. And, you know, I often recommend to people, you know, read a Buddhist article, see if it appeals to you. Maybe Thich Nhat Hanh will appeal to you, the way he writes about Buddhism, or maybe read Marcus Aurelius in Meditations. That may appeal to you.
You brought up politicians. You know, one thing I've been thinking about, not so much in terms of politics, but more politicians themselves, is, and I don't know if you have any opinions on this, it just seems more and more, and I'm from Canada, but whether it's Canada, the States, any politicians I'm seeing, it seems like we're less interested in politicians discussing, you know, concepts or the ability to think in conceptual terms. They'll be asked, you know, how will you deal with the pandemic? How will you deal with foreign policy? Which I guess is the job of a politician, but I'd be fascinated, you know, if they were to ask a politician, you know, what do you think about, you know, the cardinal virtues of, as expressed by Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus, or it just seems that there's less interest now from leaders in, you know, philosophical ideas or conceptual ideas, or even just scientific ideas. I mean, how many of them could talk about things like quantum mechanics or you know, I know Marcus Aurelius, I think it was Marcus Aurelius, discussed the need for philosopher kings, or the benefit of philosophy. It just seems that our politicians nowadays are much less versed in, or maybe forever, conceptual thinking. They're much more focused on specific policies, which I understand why, but it concerns me because the world changes so fast. I mean, like, what was President Barack Obama's policy towards, during his campaign, his policy to Deepwater Horizon, right? He didn't have one because it didn't happen. It just seems that we should be more thinking about, or we should be more encouraging politicians to think philosophically and conceptually, and encouraging that, as opposed to such an emphasis on specific policy proposals. I don't know if Stoics would have some ideas on that. I just think leaders in general, even in Freemasonry, are not well versed in concepts like they could be or should be.
All right, well, there's a lot in philosophy that can be explored. I know I came to it later in life. I'm just so glad that I found it. I could have missed it altogether, but it's true. There is a lot in philosophy that can help you understand topics better, because the first thing you realize is that you know very little, and it's better to listen to understand a certain topic, to gain more knowledge about not just the facts of a situation, but also how you may see a certain situation versus how I may see it. Because ultimately, we all have subjective views of the world. There may be certain topics in the world of politics that keep coming up, for example, like domestic security, healthcare, finances, things like that. Those topics may keep coming up, but if we don't really have an understanding of how different people are reacting to it or what their expectations are, then yeah, we're talking. It's almost like a flash sale at the store. They just talk about how low the price is. Whether you need the new TV or whatever it is may not matter too much. If you can get this for only $49.95, get in line now, and you see a whole bunch of people standing there, you're being misled. You're being sold the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it. I like that I think oftentimes we are being sold the wrong thing, and maybe philosophy in general and Stoicism in particular is a good way to help us kind of discern maybe what the right thing versus what the wrong thing is, and try to look to find the people selling the right thing as opposed to those selling the wrong thing. Before we finish, I'll put it down in the description for this video, but if you want to give a shout out to some of your work where people can connect with Stoic Dan to learn more about Stoicism.
Great. Well, yeah, right now I'm most active on Twitter. That's where I usually post my new videos, and I'm also retweeting other philosophical ideas from other scholars in the world. So you can find me on Twitter, Stoic Dan Speaks, and all my other social media contacts and all my other work, like lectures and interviews and such, are at stoicdan.com.
I will be throwing that all down there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you reaching out to me through Twitter in this case, and also you taking the time to discuss, I think, a very valuable topic for Freemasons and for the world in general right now. So thank you so much.